In Mexico, the army has confirmed the death of one of the country's most feared drug lords, known as El Mencho, caught and killed in a dawn raid. He was killed in an operation in the town of Telpapa.
For over a decade, nobody could find him. Not the DEA, not the Mexican military, not a $30 million bounty. He was untouchable. And then, overnight, he was dead. But here is what the news is not telling you. El Mencho was not found. He was handed over. Someone inside his circle, someone he trusted with his life, made a phone call. And when you find out who it was and why they did it, you will never look at the world's most powerful cartel the same way again.
For the military who killed him in a raid, injured him initially, and then he died en route to Mexico City. But of course, we're seeing the unfolding violence that goes with that, as his organization is extremely powerful and very, very well armed.
On the morning of February the 22nd, 2026, the Mexican military killed the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere. Not arrested, not captured. Killed. His name was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, but the world knew him as El Mencho, and for more than a decade, governments on both sides of the border had been hunting him without success. The operation took place in the mountains around Talpa, in the western Mexican state of Jalisco. Army Special Forces moved in on a compound believed to be one of his hiding spots. There was a firefight. 4 cartel members were killed at the scene. 3 others were seriously wounded, including El Mencho himself, who was struck by multiple gunshot wounds. He was loaded onto a military helicopter and airlifted towards Mexico City. He never made it. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes died during that flight, somewhere over the mountains of Jalisco, at around 59 or 60 years old, depending on which records you believe. Within hours of the news breaking, 6 Mexican states went into a state of serious unrest. This was not a coincidence. It was a coordinated response by the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known in Spanish as the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG, the organization El Mencho had built from nothing into one of the most powerful and most dangerous criminal enterprises on the planet. Roadblocks appeared on major highways across Jalisco, Michoacán, Colima, Tamaulipas, Guanajuato, and Aguascalientes. Buses were set on fire in the middle of roads. Trucks were torched. Pharmacies and convenience stores burned in Guanajuato. Gunfire was reported in multiple cities simultaneously. Near the airport in Guadalajara, Mexico's second-largest city, shots were heard and videos circulated online showing passengers running across the tarmac trying to find cover. In Puerto Vallarta, the resort town that thousands of American and Canadian tourists visit every year, plumes of smoke rose over the city and Air Canada suspended all flights in and out. Jalisco's governor activated a code red. Public transportation across the state was suspended. Citizens were told to shelter in place. The United States State Department issued advisories warning American citizens in Jalisco, Michoacán, and Tamaulipas to stay indoors. The scale of the response was staggering, and it was entirely deliberate. This is how the cartel communicates. When you come for us, we burn the country. It is a message written in fire and smoke, and on that morning, they were writing it across 6 states at the same time. To understand why the death of one man could trigger that level of chaos, you have to understand what El Mencho actually was. He was not simply a drug trafficker. He was not simply a cartel leader. He was, according to the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, one of the most powerful and most dangerous drug traffickers in the world. The DEA placed him at the top of their most wanted list. The United States State Department was offering $15 million for information leading to his capture. The Mexican government had put up an additional 300 million pesos. Combined, the reward for finding him was worth more than $30 million. And for years, nobody collected. In February 2025, the administration of President Donald Trump designated CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization. That is not a classification that gets applied lightly. It puts the cartel in the same legal category as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It means that providing any form of support to CJNG carries the same legal consequences as supporting an internationally recognized terrorist group. The reasoning was straightforward. CJNG, under El Mencho's leadership, had been identified as one of the 2 primary organizations responsible for flooding the United States with fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that has killed over 500,000 Americans since 2015. That number, 500,000 deaths, is larger than the combined American death toll from every war the United States has fought since the end of the Vietnam War. The cartel El Mencho built operates in more than 28 of Mexico's 31 states. It has distribution networks in all 50 American states. It has operations in Europe, Asia, and South America. It is, by most assessments, a global criminal enterprise with revenues that rival those of legitimate multinational corporations. And at the center of all of it, for more than a decade, was a man that almost nobody could find. There are almost no confirmed photographs of El Mencho from recent years. He gave no interviews. He made no public appearances. He did not use social media. He moved constantly between remote mountain compounds in Jalisco and Michoacan. He communicated through encrypted channels and trusted almost no one outside an extremely tight inner circle. The few times his voice surfaced publicly, it was in audio recordings, threats directed at rivals and government officials, his identity confirmed only by those who recognized him. For most of the world, El Mencho was a name attached to a grainy old photograph and a $15 million bounty. He was a ghost. Now he is gone. But the story of how Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes became El Mencho, how a boy from a village so small and so poor that most people have never heard of it, became the leader of an organization that terrorized 2 countries and contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. That story is not a simple one. It does not begin with power. It does not begin with money or violence or ambition, at least not in the way most people imagine. It begins in a place with dirt roads and no running water, in a farming community in the mountains of Western Mexico, where the options available to a child were as limited as the landscape allowed. He was born in 1966. He dropped out of school before finishing 5th grade. He was carrying a rifle and guarding marijuana fields before he was 15 years old. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had crossed illegally into the United States, built a drug distribution network across Northern California, been arrested by federal authorities, and been deported back to Mexico. And that, for most people, would have been the end of it. For Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, it was barely the beginning. What came next? The police badge, the cartel initiation, the marriage that connected him to criminal money, the founding of CJNG, the helicopter his men shot out of the sky, the fentanyl, empire, the bounty, the years of invisibility, and finally the morning of February 22nd, 2026. And a helicopter ride to Mexico City that he did not survive is one of the most extraordinary and most devastating stories to come out of the Mexican drug war. And it started in an avocado field. The village of Nanos de Chila sits in the mountains of Michoacan in western Mexico. It is the kind of place that does not appear on most maps, and if it does, it is little more than a dot with a name attached to it. There are no major roads leading in or out. There is no significant industry. There is no particular reason for anyone outside the region to have ever heard of it. In 1966, when Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born there, the village was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most isolated and economically forgotten communities in the country. The families who lived there grew avocados because that was what the land and the climate allowed. It was not a comfortable living, it was survival, and not always a reliable version of it. The Oseguera family had nothing in the way of wealth or influence. Nemesio was born into a household where the idea of finishing school was not something that could be taken for granted. Education, in that context, was a luxury that competed directly with the need to work and to contribute to the family's income. By the time he reached 5th grade, the competition was over. He left school and went to work in the fields, following the same path as his father and as virtually everyone else around him. He was not yet a teenager. What made the mountains of western Mexico different from other poor rural parts of the country was not the avocados, it was everything that grew alongside them. The same terrain and climate that made the region suitable for avocado farming also made it ideal for growing marijuana and opium poppies. And where those crops grew, the people who trafficked them were never far behind. The cartels, or the organizations that would eventually become cartels, had roots in those mountains that went back generations. For the families who lived there, the traffickers were not distant criminals operating in some other world. They were present, visible, and, compared to the avocado farmers, extraordinarily wealthy. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes would have understood that contrast from a very young age. By the time he was 14 years old, he was no longer working in the avocado fields. He had taken a job working for the traffickers, standing guard over marijuana plantations with a rifle in his hands, while older men carried out the actual harvesting. It is difficult to fully process what that means. A 14-year-old boy, armed, working for criminal organizations in the mountains of Michoacan. But in the context of that place and that time, it was not unusual. It was, for many young men in that region, one of the few ways to move beyond the poverty that the land offered. What appears to have separated Nemesio from others who made the same choice was his ability to observe and to calculate. The farmers stayed poor, the traffickers got rich. That was the simple equation, and he understood it clearly. But he also understood that staying in those mountains, even in the service of the traffickers, had a ceiling. There was a bigger world beyond Michoacan, and sometime in the mid-1980s, he decided to reach it. He crossed the border into the United States illegally. He was somewhere between 18 and 20 years old at the time. He spoke limited English. He had no documentation, no money to speak of, and no established connections on the American side. What he did have was a working knowledge of how the drug trade operated, gained over several years of low-level involvement in the mountains of Western Mexico. It was not much, but it was something, and it was enough to get started. He ended up in the San Francisco Bay Area, operating under a series of false identities that he used to avoid detection by American authorities. The names he used at various points included Ruben Avila, Jose Lopez, Miguel Valadez, and Carlos Hernandez, among others. The use of multiple identities was not unusual for undocumented migrants, but the number and variety of names he maintained suggests a deliberate and organized approach to staying hidden. He was not simply trying to avoid immigration enforcement, he was building a life in the criminal economy and doing it carefully. In 1986, American law enforcement caught up with him for the first time. He was arrested in San Francisco on charges of possessing stolen property and carrying a loaded firearm. It was a relatively minor arrest in the grand scheme of things, but it was significant for one reason. It was the first time United States law enforcement obtained his fingerprints. He was processed, he was released, and he went straight back to what he had been doing. Through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, Nemesio moved steadily up the hierarchy of the Bay Area drug trade. He was no longer simply involved in low-level dealing. He and his brother Abraham built a distribution network for heroin that operated across Northern California, with operations centered in Sacramento and the Bay Area and supply routes running through the Central Valley. It was a serious operation, generating serious money, and it attracted serious attention. In 1991, the United States Drug Enforcement Administration caught both brothers. The case against them was solid enough that neither chose to fight it at trial. They pleaded guilty in 1992. Abraham received a 10-year sentence. Nemesio received 5 years. For many people who pass through the American federal prison system and are subsequently deported, that is the final chapter of their story in the United States. They serve their time. They get sent back to wherever they came from. Life continues in a smaller and more constrained way than it might have otherwise. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes served his sentence and was deported back to Mexico, standard procedure. He was, from the perspective of American authorities, another criminal being sent home. The case was closed, the file was archived, and the DEA moved on to other matters. There was no particular reason to expect that this man, a mid-level heroin distributor from Northern California who had just finished a 5-year sentence, was going to become anyone's problem again in any significant way. What happened next is the part of his story that even now seems almost impossible to accept at face value. Rather than returning to the drug trade immediately, or retreating to the anonymity of rural Michoacan, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes joined the police force in Jalisco. He put on a uniform. He carried a badge. He became, at least on paper, a law enforcement officer in the state that would later become the home territory of the most powerful cartel he would ever build. The obvious question is why? The answer, looking back at what came, later seems clear enough. He was not there to enforce the law. He was there to learn how the law worked. He wanted to understand how police operations were structured, how information was gathered and shared, which officers and which departments were vulnerable to corruption and which were not. He wanted to know who could be bought, how much they cost, and what they would do in exchange for cartel money. He was, in effect, conducting an extended intelligence operation against the state, using the state's own uniform as his cover. He did not stay a police officer for long. He did not need to. By the time he left the force and moved into the criminal world with the full weight of that knowledge behind him, he understood something that most drug traffickers never bother to learn firsthand. He understood his enemy from the inside. He knew how they thought, how they operated, and exactly where they were weak. That knowledge, combined with everything he had already learned on the streets of California and in the mountains of Michoacan, made him a different kind of operator. Not just a criminal, but a strategist. And the organization he would eventually build would reflect that from the very beginning. In the early 2000s, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes entered the organized criminal world in Mexico at a level that reflected the groundwork he had quietly been laying since his return from the United States. He joined the Mencho cartel, an organization operating at the time as a satellite of the Sinaloa cartel, which was itself in the process of becoming the dominant drug trafficking operation in the country under the leadership of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The Mencho cartel handled distribution across western Mexico, covering territory in Jalisco, Colima, and Michoacan. It was well-connected, reasonably well-funded, and positioned inside a network that reached all the way to the top of the Mexican drug trade. Nemesio did not start anywhere near the top. He joined the cartel's security apparatus, working as part of the armed unit that protected one of its senior figures, a drug lord named Armando Valencia Cornelio, known by the nickname El Maradona. His job was not to move drugs or manage money. His job was to use violence or the credible threat of it to keep his employer safe and to make problems disappear when they arose. It was dangerous, unglamorous work, but it placed him close to power and he was paying attention to everything around him. In August 2003, Mexican authorities arrested El Maradona. At roughly the same time, a rival organization called Los Zetas launched an armed offensive against the Mencho cartel in Michoacan. The cartel's leadership structure began to fracture under the combined pressure of law enforcement action and rival violence. The Valencia family, which controlled the organization, relocated to Jalisco, and Nemesio went with them. It was during this period of instability that he made a move that would shape the rest of his life in ways that went far beyond simple criminal advancement. He married Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia. Her brothers ran an organization known as Los Quines, which functioned as the financial arm of the cartel's operations. They were money launderers and financial managers for the criminal underworld, the people who took the proceeds of drug trafficking and moved them through legitimate businesses and banking systems to make them usable. By marrying into that family, Nemesio connected himself simultaneously to two of the things that any serious criminal enterprise requires above all else: the capacity for organized violence, which he already had, and access to sophisticated financial infrastructure, which he now had through his in-laws. It was a calculated alignment that transformed his position within the organization almost overnight. In Jalisco, the remnants of the Mencho cartel came under the protection of a man named Ignacio Coronel Villarreal, known throughout the criminal world as Nacho Coronel. He was a senior figure within the Sinaloa cartel and, by most accounts, one of El Chapo's most trusted associates. He controlled methamphetamine production across western Mexico, overseeing large-scale industrial laboratories that generated hundreds of millions of dollars worth of product annually. Under Nacho Coronel's wing, Nemesio moved into a different category of operation. He was no longer simply a bodyguard or an enforcer. He was managing drug routes, overseeing operations across Jalisco and Colima, and making decisions about who lived and who did not. He was becoming a cartel leader, even if he did not yet have a cartel to call his own. That changed in 2010. On the 29th of July of that year, Mexican Marines raided a property in Zapopan, just outside Guadalajara. Nacho Coronel was inside. He resisted, and he was killed. In that same year, another senior Mencho figure, Oscar Orlando Nava Valencia, was arrested by Mexican authorities. In the Puanad space of a few months, the criminal structure that Nemesio had operated within lost two of its most important pillars. The Sinaloa cartel, absorbed in its own internal politics and expansion elsewhere, was not positioned to fill the gap immediately. There was a vacuum, and Nemesio saw it with complete clarity. He did not attempt to rebuild the Mencho cartel. He did not position himself as a loyalist waiting for new orders from Sinaloa. He did something that required both confidence and a detailed understanding of how power actually works in the criminal world. He started his own organization. Between 2009 and 2010, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJN, CJNG was formed. The co-founder alongside Nemesio was a man named Eric Valencia Salazar, known as L85. The financial backing came from Los Quinis, his wife's family. The territory was Jalisco, a state with enormous strategic value. It contains Guadalajara, Mexico's second largest city. It also contains the port of Manzanillo, the busiest port in the country, and a critical entry point for the chemical precursors that would soon become central to the cartel's entire business model. What distinguished CJNG from the organizations that came before it was not simply its willingness to use violence. Mexican cartels had always used violence. What made CJNG different was the way it combined two approaches that had previously been associated with separate organizations. From the Sinaloa cartel, Nemesio took the operational model: efficient drug trafficking, careful management of political corruption, and a degree of community engagement in the territories it controlled. From Los Zetas, the paramilitary organization that had terrorized Mexico throughout the 2000s, he took the military tactics: extreme coordinated violence, paramilitary-style operations, and a willingness to attack the Mexican state directly, rather than simply trying to avoid it. The result was an organization that could negotiate and corrupt when it needed to, and wage something close to open warfare when it chose to. No cartel had ever combined those two approaches quite so deliberately or quite so effectively. The moment that announced CJNG's arrival to the wider world came in the spring of 2015. Mexican authorities had intelligence suggesting that El Mencho, as Nemesio was now known throughout the criminal world, was hiding in the mountains near Villa Purificación in southern Jalisco. They launched an operation involving soldiers, federal police, and 5 military helicopters. It was an ambitious effort to capture the man who had, by that point, already become one of Mexico's most wanted criminals. What the authorities did not know was that El Mencho had been warned they were coming. As the helicopters approached, cartel gunmen on the ground opened fire. The weapons they used were not the small arms or even the heavy machine guns typically associated with cartel violence. They were rocket-propelled grenades, military-grade weapons designed for use against armored vehicles and low-flying aircraft. One helicopter took a direct hit to its rotor. It spiraled, caught fire, and crashed into the trees below. 9 law enforcement officers died. It was the first time in the entire history of Mexico's drug war that a criminal organization had shot down a military aircraft. The first time. And they had done it to protect one man. While the military scrambled to respond to the crash and the ongoing firefight, El Mencho disappeared into the mountains. He vanished completely. And then, as if to confirm that the attack had been a deliberate statement rather than a desperate act of self-defense, CJNG launched a coordinated operation across Jalisco. Roadblocks went up across the state. Vehicles were set on fire on major highways. Gas stations were torched. Government buildings were attacked. The message was written in destruction and left for every law enforcement agency in the country to read. Come for me again, and this is what you will face. For years after that, the Mexican military did not launch another serious operation targeting El Mencho directly. During the same period, CJNG was transforming the economics of the Mexican drug trade in a way that would have consequences reaching far beyond the country's borders. From around 2013 onwards, the cartel began shifting its focus away from heroin and towards synthetic opioids, particularly fentanyl. The logic was straightforward and brutal. Heroin requires poppy fields, which require land, labor, growing seasons, and harvesting. Fentanyl can be manufactured in a laboratory. The chemical precursors needed to produce it were being manufactured in China and could be shipped directly into Mexico through the port of Manzanillo, the same port that sat in CJNG's home territory of Jalisco. 1 kilogram of fentanyl cost roughly $4,000 to produce. That same kilogram, once cut and distributed on American streets, is worth upwards of $1 million. The profit margins have no real equivalent in the legitimate economy. CJNG did not simply enter the fentanyl market. According to the DEA and other American law enforcement agencies, the cartel was instrumental in building the Mexican fentanyl industry at industrial scale, training chemists, establishing supply chains, and developing distribution networks that reached into every corner of the United States. From 2015 to 2025, fentanyl overdoses killed more than 500,000 Americans. CJNG was not solely responsible for that number. The Sinaloa cartel was also a major supplier, and Chinese manufacturers provided the precursor chemicals that made production possible. But CJNG, under El Mencho's leadership, was identified by American authorities as one of the two primary pipelines responsible for the scale of the crisis. Through all of it, El Mencho himself remained invisible. After 2015, confirmed sightings of him were essentially non-existent. The photographs that circulated were years old and of uncertain reliability. He operated through intermediaries, communicated through encrypted systems, and moved constantly between remote compounds in the mountains of Jalisco and Michoacan. His personal security operation was extraordinarily sophisticated. His inner circle included former Mexican military special forces soldiers, men with professional training who were paid cartel wages to protect one person. A second security ring of around 120 men was dedicated entirely to setting up ambushes against anyone who might attempt to get close to him. He trusted almost no one and gave the outside world almost nothing to work with. For over a decade, it was enough. The DEA listed him. The State Department offered $15 million for him. Mexico offered its own reward on top of that. And still, for all practical purposes, El Mencho did not exist. He was a name, a voice on occasional audio recordings, and a reputation built on a body count that stretched from the mountains of Jalisco to the streets of American cities thousands of miles away. While El Mencho remained hidden in the mountains of western Mexico, the world around him was slowly closing in, not through any single dramatic operation, but through a gradual process of attrition that targeted the people closest to him. One by one, the members of his family and his inner circle were arrested, charged, and imprisoned. The organization continued to function, but the personal world he had constructed around himself was being taken apart piece by piece. His son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, had been groomed for leadership from the time he was a teenager. Born in San Francisco in 1990, he was an American citizen by birth, a fact that would determine where he was eventually tried. Court documents described him as the cartel's second-in-command, an enforcer who had ordered at least 100 killings and personally shot 2 people. Mexican authorities arrested him in 2014, then released him. They arrested him again and released him again. A third arrest, a third release. The pattern drew widespread suspicion of corruption within the Mexican judicial system. He was finally held in 2015 and extradited to the United States in February 2020. The trial in Washington, D.C. ended with a guilty verdict on all counts, including conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine, cocaine and fentanyl, weapons charges, and murder conspiracy. The sentence was life in prison plus 30 years with no possibility of parole and a forfeiture order of $6 billion. His sister, Jessica Johanna, was arrested in Washington, D.C. while attempting to attend her brother's court appearance and served approximately 2.5 years on financial crime charges. His wife, Rosalinda, was arrested in Mexico in November 2021 for managing the cartel's finances and was released just weeks before her husband's death. His brother, Antonio, was arrested in December 2022. His brother Abraham was arrested in February 2025. His son-in-law faked his own death, moved to California under a false identity, and was caught in November 2024, later receiving an 11-year sentence. The man who had once presided over a global criminal empire had, by early 2026, watched his entire family disappear behind bars one by one. There is one moment from this period that carries particular weight when viewed alongside how everything ended. On the morning of June 26, 2020, Omar Garcia Harfuch, then the chief of police for Mexico City, was traveling through the wealthy neighborhood of Lomas de Chapultepec when armed men blocked his route and opened fire with .50 caliber machine guns, rifles, and grenades. Both of his bodyguards were killed. A passing civilian was also killed. Garcia Harfuch was struck by 3 bullets and survived. From his hospital bed, he identified CJNG as responsible and described the attack as unprecedented. He was right. Attacking the police chief of the capital in broad daylight in one of the most visible neighborhoods in the country was a statement that no target was beyond El Mencho's reach. It was also one of the most consequential mistakes of his life. By February 2026, Omar Garcia Harfuch had been appointed Mexico's Federal Secretary of Security, the most senior law enforcement position in the country. On the morning of February the 22nd, he was one of the officials who signed off on the operation in the mountains around Talpa, Jalisco, that killed Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. The man El Mencho had tried to assassinate 6 years earlier was the man who helped oversee his death. The operation involved Mexican Army Special Forces, Air Force helicopters, National Guard units, and intelligence from both Mexican and American authorities. The Special Forces located the compound, the cartel opened fire, and this time the military pressed forward. 4 cartel members were killed at the scene. El Mencho was wounded, loaded onto a helicopter, and died during the flight to Mexico City. What comes next is uncertain, and the history of the Mexican drug war offers little comfort. When El Chapo was captured, the Sinaloa cartel fractured and the violence that followed was worse than before. The removal of a leader does not remove the organization. CJNG has been operating at scale for more than 15 years with distribution networks across the United States, established supplier connections in China, and a presence across multiple continents. The fentanyl laboratories will not stop producing. The precursor chemicals will keep arriving. What will change is the question of who controls all of it, and that question will almost certainly be answered through violence. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born in a village most people have never heard of, left school before he was 12, and died of gunshot wounds in a military helicopter over the mountains of Jalisco at around 60 years old. His son is serving life plus 30 years. His family is gone. The empire may survive. But for the first time in over a decade, El Mencho is no longer the most wanted man in the Western Hemisphere. He is no longer anything at all.